So today's video is going to go into weird alien costumes, and we're going to look at Londo's silly hair, but just a heads up that I'm also going to talk about colonialism and fascism, because Babylon 5. And, you know, because the year is 2021 and the name of the place is Discourse, I'm giving you a heads up before we get into that. And I also think it's good practice to locate where I'm coming from in discourse like this. I am both British and Egyptian, so I have ancestors who were colonizers and also who experienced colonialism. And in addition to that, as an immigrant non-Indigenous Canadian, I have lived most of my life on unceded territory. I have my own work to do in terms of decolonization, as do we all. And with that, on with the video.
I want a rebirth of glory.
I want justice.
Hi friends, it's Sarah. Welcome to Costume Codex and another deep dive into costumes and meaning. This time we're going to be taking a look at Babylon 5 and the case of the Centari and the Narn. I've given my thesis before on what makes truly great costuming. That it needs to serve the story, and it can do this by adding to character, theme, or world building. A lot of my previous videos have been about theme and character. This time we're going to look at things from a more world-building aspect, although good world-building then adds to character and theme, as we shall see. World-building is a big part of any science fiction story, especially anything that involves alien culture. And Babylon 5 is perfect for this kind of analysis, because J. Michael Straczynski had the narrative and the themes and most of the story mapped out before they began filming the series. And because the design team knew what was coming, they could design accordingly and make it a real collaboration across all disciplines. The design team being Anna Bruce Ayling on costumes and John Locovelli as production designer. They didn't have a big budget, but they had time and they put in the effort, and the results speak for themselves. I could probably delve into any of these cultures and find interesting themes and interesting design aspects, and I may come back to at least one of them. But this time, as I said, we're going to focus on Londo and Jakar, the cultures being the Narn and the Centari. Regarding spoilers, I'm going to be discussing the themes of the series as a whole and some aspects of the characters' arcs. One of the main themes of Babylon 5 is conflict and the aftermath of conflict, the damages it leaves behind, and how the way we deal with that aftermath can lead to reconciliation, or it can lead to bitterness, resentment, and endless cycles of conflict. The story begins in the aftermath of two conflicts between cultures. The post-war reconciliation between the humans and the Minbari, and the second one is the post-colonial conflict between the Narn and the Centari. In brief, the Centari once ruled an empire and enslaved other races, particularly the Narn. The Narn waged a war of independence, ousting the Centari, but at great cost. The wounds are deep. Both sides are bitter. Londo and Jakar represent their two worlds, and they too are deeply wounded and bitter. Londo mourns for the loss of the greatness of empire.
A washed-up old Republican, dreaming of better days.
Jakar wants vengeance for the pain of his people.
I will confess that I look forward to the day when we have cleansed the universe of the Centauri and carved their bones into little flutes for Narn children. It is a dream I have.
That's where the story begins. To put this post-colonial allegory into the context of when it was written, Babylon 5 was produced in 1994. That was the same year that South Africa held its first post-apartheid free election. It was 3 years away from the British Empire's handoff of Hong Kong, and 3 years after the end of the Soviet Union. The First Gulf War was a recent memory, and the war in the Balkans was still ongoing. So the aftermath of empire was in the zeitgeist, and story is how we process the stuff that is going on in the world. Star Trek Deep Space Nine, for example, which aired about the same time as Babylon 5, also had a post-colonial narrative. So yeah, the aftermath of empire was in our stories. Okay, enough preamble. Time to look at some costumes. Well, first off, it's super camp. But I think the camp is intentional. At least they fully embraced it. It's really hard to take this guy seriously, and I think that's the point. Looking beyond the camp, he looks human. There's no prosthetic nose, brow, ears, or anything. There is a bald cap, the eyebrows, and, ah yes, the hair. I think we can safely say that the hair is reminiscent of the bicorn hat that Napoleon Bonaparte was known for. In fact, much of Londo's wardrobe and set decor has a definite Napoleonic inspiration. The aesthetics of the period were a mix of Rococo and Baroque, which was a look back to the periods just prior to the Revolution, and also influence from classical Rome. The idea was to set Napoleon up as the inheritor of the Roman emperor, and align France of the day with what they saw as the height of civilization, the vanished glory of Rome. That's the source the design team is drawing on for the Centari. And the campness, well, the campness kind of fits, and adds to the element of the faded glory. Everything is ornate and calculated for appearance. I mean, take another look at that hair. Apart from the allusion to the bicorn hat, I also see an influence from a peacock's tail. Talk about style over substance. This tells us a lot about a culture. We know that they're backward-looking, which indicates a suggestion of decay and decadence. Londo himself tells us he is dreaming of better days. We can also see that they're concerned with displaying position and status. We see that this is a hierarchical society, a monarchy, even if they ironically call themselves a republic. This in itself is an allusion to Rome and the same idea of vanished empirical glory. The neoclassical influence in the Centari is also present in the color palette. We got purples and whites and golds. We see the shape of Londo's hair is not only common in his culture, but it is itself a design motif, repeated throughout elements of set decoration and costume. It's clearly significant to the culture, and the size and shape seems to be an indication of status, until Emperor Cartagia decides to change the fashion. The crest also conveys something in its absence. Its absence on women tells us something about the gendered nature of this society and its value of masculinity. The women, in fact, shave their heads almost completely bald, with a ponytail at the back. So this is a society that values gender roles and wants them to be immediately apparent. You cannot miss this hairstyle. It is clear throughout the story that women occupy a lower station in Centari culture. The first Centari woman we see is Adira, an enslaved dancer who is drawn to Londo because of his position. Nearly every woman we see in the series is mostly defined by the men in their lives. It would appear that women in this society are largely for display and for marriage.
I am what I was made. By my father, by Londo, by society.
And that would indicate that this is a patriarchal society, also a very heteronormative one, as well as it being hierarchical. We can see this in the way that their gowns are very ornate and impractical, which again is reminiscent of Rococo styles, though it's actually toned down from the heights of ridiculousness that actual history took. Now this show was written in the 90s, and we could easily think that the Centari women are written this way because that's the way the writers wrote women. But that's not the way this writer wrote women. Because if we look at the rest of Babylon 5, we see plenty of women in power, women as people, but not the Centari women. And actually, that's a really good place to start looking at the Narn culture. Jakar has a female aide, Natoth. She is immediately respected. Maybe even, no, definitely feared a little. And her costume does not noticeably indicate her gender. We see little indication that the Narns place value on gender distinctions. That something is quite rare in human cultures, where dress is often a common signifier of gender. We also don't see obvious distinctions of rank in the costumes of the Narn. Nothing that reads to us as displays of wealth. And this is all coded for us, the viewers. Unlike the Centari, the Narn's aesthetic does not explicitly allude to any real-world cultures or historical eras. The general shape bears some similarity to armor, and perhaps some medieval influence is at play, but there is no clear and specific coding, the way there is with the Centari. The Narn's aesthetic is beautiful, a sophisticated design with an emphasis on natural materials, leather and metal. The color palette is earthy with orange and red tones, including red eyes. At first, all this red feels kind of threatening, as Jakar does when we first meet him, and above all, this feels alien, in a way the Centari doesn't. So in film analysis and cultural studies, we often talk about the idea of the other, There's the one who is the subject, who the camera is on their side, and everything is seen through their eyes. They are the us in the story. And then there are various others who are more or less othered, who are put at a distance from us. You may have heard about this in relation to the male gaze, where the man is the subject and the woman is the object. There's a similar thing when we talk about the representation of various cultures. There is the one who is presented as subject, who tends to fall under what we think of as the default categories. And then there is everybody else who is treated as other. And in science fiction, as a rule, the humans in the story are always the subject. And then the aliens are more or less othered, depending on how human-like or not human-like they are. In terms of the Narn and the Centari, we can see that the Centari are the more like us, the more human-like, and the Narn are the less like us, the more othered. The Narn, in fact, begin the story feeling very alien and very threatening. They begin the story as the aggressors, dealing weapons and striking first, not the sort to easily have sympathy with. We are told that they have been wronged in the past, but we haven't seen it. And then we look to the Centari, and yes, we've been told that they were conquerors, but that was in the past. And I mean, look at Londo. He's a charming rogue. He's a buffoon. How could he be any kind of danger? Besides, his people look like us. And when I say they look like us, I mean they're meant to look like the target audience of Western media in the early 90s. I don't think it's an accident that on a show with a great deal of diversity, all of the Centari are played by white folks. And for contrast, I want to look at how the various kinds of othering is played out on DS9 in their version of a story about the colonized and the ex-colonialists. On DS9, the empire builders are Cardassians, and they do not look like us. Their design also takes inspiration from history, but in this case, it's the aesthetics of fascists and Nazis, and they mix in design inspired by snakes and reptiles. Their skin is gray and scaly. They are the ones who look alien and threatening. Just look at the sharp, imposing lines on their uniform. By contrast, the Bajorans, the survivors of the occupation, are presented in warm tones and soft curves. Their aesthetic takes inspiration from Buddhist monks, and their faces are almost human. Not quite, but almost. So the aliens who are most relatable to us in this story are the survivors, not the perpetrators. DS9's post-colonial story is about how a culture and an individual survives that kind of trauma and rebuilds. And the human characters show us how to be an ally, how to help people overcoming trauma. It is a great story, but it's not the one that Babylon 5 is telling. So is Babylon 5 bringing us into a story sympathetic to a colonialist? I mean, they are colonialists, they are empire builders, they are supremacists, and yet Londo feels like someone's drunk uncle at a wedding. We are lulled into underestimating him. He's charming. We empathize with him. After all he wants is to reclaim the vanished glory of his culture's past. He wants to restore its greatness. What could go wrong with that? Okay, I'm not being remotely subtle anymore, am I? But you and I are looking at this from the lens of 2021. We might have a slightly different impression of the dangers posed by a buffoonish man with silly hair. But Londo isn't actually that. That wouldn't be nearly as interesting or compelling a story, and certainly not as satisfying.
My people have a manifest destiny.
One of the main themes of Babylon 5 is authoritarianism versus the individual. And most of the characters spend the bulk of the story fighting fascism in one form or another. But this story is meant to be a novel. It's meant to be a tapestry on many layers. So Londo works as a cautionary tale. He shows us how tempting power and authority and authoritarianism can be. How someone can take steps they think are for the greater good and find themselves a monster.
I want it all back, the way that it was.
Everything he does, he believes he is doing for that vanished glory that he wants to reclaim. He never thinks about the blood that glory was built out of. Not until it's too late. Londo is our cautionary tale, but he isn't the only Centari in this story. Veer is Londo's assistant, and the closest thing he has to a real friend. He hates the road Londo takes, but he sticks by him out of loyalty. Veer sees his culture for what it is, but he is only one man, and with little power, what can he do? And his costume tells us how little and how low his power is. Look at his hair crest, and how his costume is always less elaborate than the other Centari. With every watch, I see more in Veer here. He was born into this culture, this colonial culture. The wealth of his civilization was built on the exploitation of others. He is the little guy in all of this, and he doesn't know how to stand up to the big fellas. But he wants things to be different. He wants reconciliation. There is even a scene when he tries to apologize to G'Kar and gets a hard lesson on how words are not enough. Okay, there I go, forgetting to be subtle again. Back to the matter at hand. We have all this world building for this culture that these two belong to, one which presents a heightened likeness of cultures of our own world. There is a simultaneous familiarity to us, but also somewhat removed. This othering but only slightly thing. And the way this culture and these characters are presented makes them kind of buffoonish, makes us not take them too seriously, and that allows the story to subvert our expectations.
I could warn you, of course, but you would not listen.
So that's the Centari. But why are the Narn made so alien? What story purpose is served in that? So Babylon 5 is kind of doing a thing here. They are starting out with characters who appear in their culture to be very different from the audience watching at home, and very different from the human characters who are our window on the world. And the human characters do make judgments about G'Kar and the Narn, because I said they initially appear threatening. G'Kar initially appears kind of big and scary, but he tells us himself,
no one here is exactly what he appears.
And as we move through the story and through his arc, the human characters and the audience learn that G'Kar is not a big scary guy. He's a good man. In fact, by the end of the story, he is a remarkable man. So again, just like Londo, we have our expectations subverted. The two in that are a foil for each other, as they are in many things in the story. One who appears to be a silly buffoon, who is utterly harmless, turns out to be really not. The other one, who appears to be some kind of threat, turns out to be, well, the complete opposite. In fact, though the design team doesn't pull from specific cultural touchstones, the writing definitely pulls from, in fact, though the design doesn't pull direct coding from cultures in the real world, the writing pulls some interesting influences from history. There is definitely inspiration taken from Nelson Mandela, Dr. King, and Gandhi. So I should say that we're talking about fiction here. And yeah, G'Kar is a remarkable character. But I gotta point out that people of color, people that this coding is being taken from, should not have to be remarkable to not face prejudice. This could be maybe looked at through a discussion of respectability politics. But as a person who benefits from fair-skinned privilege, I'm not the one to lead that discussion. So yeah, G'Kar has to be Gandhi to play in this world. And for the characters to honor him the way that they do. You do not have to be. And this is not something we should expect from people in the real world. Anyway, this story was written in the 1990s, and I believe in the best of faith. And like I said, I think Babylon 5 is doing a thing here. They are trying to tell us one of the simplest stories there is. Don't judge a book by its cover. I mean, that's what subverting expectations, that's the story behind it. Don't judge a book by its cover. Which could be exactly what I'm doing by analyzing characters by costume. So yeah, Babylon 5 doing a thing. We've got two characters who are foils for each other, both of whom subvert our expectations in opposite ways. But this story does not make the mistake of falling into false equivalence. There is no lazy both-sidisms here. It may appear that way in the beginning when the characters are simply inheritors of their people's history. But again, that is the setup before their arcs truly begin. There are moments when Jakar could have taken a path like Londo's, just as there are times, many times, when Londo could have turned back. But they made choices, and their actions have consequences, and there is no equivalence in their actions. It is a deeply complicated story. I mean, I could probably go on forever just about the episode The Long Night of Londo Mollari and what it has to say about truth and reconciliation. So I said this was about design and world building. And as you see, we have two cultures, one presented as more human-like and clearly European-inspired, and the other less human and less directly inspired, but still influenced by non-European and specifically non-white cultures. We can see how all this world building contributes to the themes of Babylon 5. These discussions about the aftermath of conflict, resolution, reconciliation, and the whole idea of authoritarianism versus the individual. And the big theme of Babylon 5, how do you do community with people who are different? And we can see how well-built worlds with clear aesthetics help give us a context to character. If their culture feels real, the character's relationship to it feels real. We can see Londo's patriotism warping into nationalism, and Veer's sincere desire for a way for his people to be better. And oh boy, do we feel Jakar's grief and marvel at his grace. In taking the time to give us a well-thought-out, thematically resonant cultural aesthetic, Drzynski and the design team gave us a better story world, which ultimately leads to a better story.
Why do you think they invaded back then?
Why does any advanced civilization seek to destroy a less advanced one? Because the land is strategically valuable, because there are resources that can be cultivated and exploited, but most of all, simply because they can.